So the floor is yours, Aleksander.
Thank you, madam.
First of all, I want to apologize you for my absence, actually, because I should be present in person with you. But unfortunately, due to my home and familiar situation, it was impossible in this year. But I hope in next year we meet finally in normal way, not via internet. On behalf of my colleagues and me, I would like to show you the presentation about the anatomical distribution of animal remains from Theodosius Harbour. Of course, this was made in a collaboration with the University Milas in Turkey, because Professor Vedat moved there from Istanbul. But of course, all scientific activities area were carried out exactly in Istanbul. So everybody of us know for sure about what I would like to tell you a little bit, because Inikapi at Marmaray site is actually well known. The excavation started there in 2004, and from the Colloquia, the Ceranea, it was, if I remember correctly, the session number 5. So from 5th colloquium, we started to present you the results of our research. Of course, it is quite important area in the Istanbul due to the traffic and connection of both bank of the Bosphorus using the metro. So this actually area, which is quite well known for all of us, is of course the area of ancient Theodosius Harbour, which was discovered there during the construction of the metro station. Towards the 5th century, with the end of a grand shipment from the Egypt, of course, the ports became to be less important, but still in use till 12th century. After it became the part of the land, so today it's not the sea bank anymore. And of course, during these archaeological activities, the large collection of animal bone samples were collected. It was over 65,000 of bones, so it was a really huge collection, which can be comparable to two others which I work from Poland, one from Wrocław and from another part of the city. And of course, majority of this bone were coming from domesticated animals, especially cattle, sheep, goats, pigs and horses. Here you can see the percentage of the number of identified specimens which were found there. General chronology is from early Byzantium to late Byzantium, so quite large. We hope that in future it would be possible to divide this huge collection to subsequent phases in the changes between them. And of course, because it was presented already partly in Lodz last year, 2 years ago, the good news is that we finally finished the chapter which will be reviewed and hopefully published, entitled Animal Skeletal Remains from Inikapi Metro and Marmara Excavation in Istanbul, and the anatomical distribution of slaughter animals' bones and assemblage in the defensive carcasses as the sources of the product. This will include the species distribution, anatomical distribution, and potential butchery assortment, which were used in cuisine. So I think it would be accessible in the future. But as you can see on this diagram here, the cow and small ruminants clearly dominating in these collections. We have a little bit of some more exotic ruminants like water buffalo, but also these two species actually, because usually in archaeology we use the sheep and goat as a group, which is caused because large similarity in anatomy of both species and actually difficulties with differences between them. So actually in the description of finds using in the archaeological analysis, we use something what was introduced quite early, and it is known as a normal anatomical distribution of the bones. Of course, the main idea of this is that we have, for example, the experiment, we put the cadaver of an animal into the ground and wait for the total destruction of soft tissues. And after collecting the bones, we are able to tell actually how many of them belong to the head, how many to belong to the trunk, more so proximal parts of the limbs, both thoracic and pelvic limb, which has quite well developed muscles, and of course less attractive parts of the limbs. So distal one is of course the hand and foot and fingers. So with this what we can known as the phalanges, which build the skeleton of a finger. Of course, this slide shows us the normal and anatomical distribution estimated for the cattle and small ruminants. So if we are looking from the point of the bones, we have 20% of them which belong to the 43% which belong to the trunk. More attractive parts is only 8%, and less attractive parts it's 15%. Fingers, which consist of 14%, are actually not important from the butchery point of view because they simply don't give any meat. Of course, it is possible to estimate the same, so normal anatomical distribution for the pigs, for the horses. Actually, if we compare the horses and ruminants, it would be similar. In pig, we have a little bit less bones belonging to the trunk and more to the fingers due to the existence of 4 fingers in this species. On the basis of this idea, we estimated the anatomical distribution of cattle and pig remains. Of course, we also used other animals like horses, dogs, and small ruminants, but in this presentation, we would like to aim on these two, so cattle and pig. And as we can see from these pictures, the red is indicated the normal anatomical distribution, and the yellow one is, of course, this would be found in Istanbul. So in a case of cattle, we can tell that we have the clear predominance of the proximal part of the thoracic and pelvic limb, and distal part of the thoracic and pelvic limb was not so large as a large. So from this point of view, we can tell that this proximal part of the limb was dominating. And what can be surprising, the intake of the axial skeleton, so this would belong to the trunk, is much smaller than the norm, which we can see here. If we are talking about the pig, the clear predominance would be visible in a head, which is dominating, and one more time the proximal part of the limb. It can tell us that meat from the head and meat from the proximal part of the limbs was the most desirable and the most used in the butchery and in the cuisine in this period of time. Of course, the archaeology and this normal anatomical distribution must be and can be compared with this, what we can find in the slaughterhouse. So this picture, of course, shows us the modern slaughterhouse with the beef, pork, and lamb. We can easily predict the normal anatomical distribution. So this, what we know from the classical archaeology, cannot be fully referent, cannot be fully compared to this, what we have as a source from the slaughterhouse. Therefore, we can tell that one more time we have the body part which belongs to the head. So head is, of course, the skull and mandible. Axial skeleton, so we have the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral vertebrae, together with the thorax, so ribs and sternum. Finally, the proximal part of the limbs, so scapula, humerus, pelvis, and the femur, and of course the distal part, so crus and so tibia and fibula, and of course in the thoracic limb it would be the radius and ulna. Distal part of the limbs like metacarpus and metatarsus and fingers has a less important use in the case of butchery because they don't give a lot of meat if we compare it with other parts of the skeleton. What belongs to the axial skeleton is listed here, so we have the one more time cervical vertebrae, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral ones, costa and ribs, and of course sternum. Sternum is the most problematic because it's not fully ossified, so we cannot find it usually in the bone sublages because it is destroyed after the death of an animal. And of course, if we are talking about the proximal part of the limb, we have something what in anatomy is known as cingulum membri thoracici. In this part of the skeleton in domestic animals, we have only scapula because the clavicle in this group of animals is missing, and of course the humerus. And together with this part of the skeleton, we have the largest muscles which belong to the thoracic. Finally, we have the similar situation in the pelvic limb, cingulum membri pelvini, this is simply pelvis, and of course the femur one more time accompanied with the largest and most developed group of the muscles. In the distal parts, we have, of course, the ossa antebrachi, so full arm, and metacarpus, and in the pelvic limb, we have ossa cruris and tarsus, together with metatarsus. Phalanges usually plays not very important role in butchery because after slaughter, they are usually separated together with the skin during the skinning of animals, so they have no use and they not belong to part of the modern carcasses, because usually the distal part of both thoracic and pelvic limb is separated on the level of carpus and tarsus. Of course, from the butcher point of view, we have the main parts of the carcasses which are presented on these pictures. If we are talking about the size and the volume of the muscles in the animals, of course, we have to remember one more time about this proximal part of the thoracic and pelvic limb and the axial skeleton, which build the trunk. And in the trunk, we have, of course, the large muscles which are going along the vertebral column, and the less prominent structures which are forming simply the wall of the abdominal and thoracic wall. Of course, we have to remember that the number of the bones in exact part of the skeleton is not directly connected with the size of the muscle there. We have, for example, the distal part of the limb, which has quite numerous bones, but the muscular tissue is not very well developed because we have simply tendons there. This picture shows us actually how it looks like if we try to put exact bones to the exact parts of the carcasses. So, for example, in the case of neck of a beef carcass, we have, of course, the all cervical vertebrae, excluding the first one, because in normal praxis, the head is separated from the carcass of a cow between the first and second cervical vertebrae. We have, of course, the loin chop, so from the first thoracic to the sixth thoracic, the entrecot from the 7th to 12th. This, what we can take in total as a musculus tristis brachii, because this is the largest muscle there, but not, of course, the only one, is belonging to the scapula and humerus, Rix plotis costa, and so on and so on. Some of the main parts of the carcass, like, for example, tenderloin, has no bones, so it's actually hard to estimate how much of meat from this part of the body would be assessed from there. Similar in a pig, we can find, for example, the back fat, which is also not connected directly with the skeleton, so the estimation of this, similar to the tenderloin, can be harder. Of course, from our earlier studies and presentations, we know that in case of a beef, we have the most miscellaneous use of the meat, because both more and less attractive parts of limbs and head can be used during cooking, roasting, grilling, drying, and so on. In pork, the head is less attractive, but we have also some informations which are coming even from the medieval or modernity that some parts of this are eatable. For example, tongue, for example, nostrils, and the muscles which are located between the head and trunk, so in the ventral part of the neck, but they have no direct connection with the bones. Of course, when we are looking on the carcasses and we compare, for example, the mass of the carcasses with the mass of a living animal, we can estimate something what is known in the butchery and veterinary sciences as a slaughter yield. And this slaughter yield in cattle is only 54%. Usually it can be, of course, higher in the meat cows, but of course we have to remember that these are totally modern breeds, which I think were not accessible in history. So from this 50% of the carcass which give us actually the meat, we have, of course, some parts which can be distinguished in butchery, which are larger. For example, a loin chop and entrecot, this is over 12%, and some which are actually very small. So, for example, rump, 1,4, flank, 1, roast beef, 1/6. It, of course, doesn't mean that they are not important, because from the anatomical and the slaughter point of view, we have to know that these actually parts are quite important and give them most valuable meat. To this belong also top side and silver side, which consist of 5.3%. Of course, in general, we can tell that when we are looking on the carcass, and we are going from the head to the tail, we are coming from the less attractive to the more attractive body part. Because, of course, in the proximal part of the both limb, we have quite well-developed muscles, which give us the most valuable and desirable part of the carcass. But also, if we are looking on the vertebral column, when we are coming from the thoracic to the lumbar part, of course, the lumbar part and sacral would be more attractive for the human. Similar, we can find this in a pig, but of course the yield is quite larger because it's over 80%. So if we compare it with the cattle, it's more attractive from the economic point of view. And we can also see one more time that these main parts of the body are simply in various intake in this carcass. Of course, we have to remember that we have also something what is known as accessory slaughter products, which in a case of a pig, it's 16%, and in case of a cattle, it's 45%. Summarizing this part, we have to remember that is, of course, the product of that slaughter, but of course, they are not the source of that meat. During our analysis, we try to modify a little bit the anatomical distribution, which is indicated here as a match. So this is modified anatomical distribution, and generate something what can be known as a butcher distribution. Here in percentage, you can see what it gives for us. And the result is that we can see in case, of course, of a cattle, that this what we have from the archaeological findings. So the proximal pod of the limb, so musculus triceps brachii and foretrunk, they have a predominance, they dominate in this body part, but also the top side and silver side, together with the hinge trunk, are also quite important, similar to the thick flank. So quite valuable and important food, but we can compare it with the normal anatomical distribution, which is a little bit another, but also show the similarities. In case of a pig, we have, of course, one problem which can be also observed in a cow. This is, of course, the head. Head is usually divided in various larger or smaller parts due to the fragmentation of the head. So therefore, we have something like overrepresentation here. Because if we compare it with normal representation and with the butcher distribution, of course, it's simply dominating. Of course, through the time we can see the differences, and in future I hope we will be able to do the same what we can see here for the cattle, pig and small ruminants through the history of Wrocław. And we can see clearly that in various phases of the history, this intake of exact body parts and exact meat and species can be different. Of course, butcher composition, as we can see here, can be also classified in other ways. So maybe in future, it would be possible to estimate somehow which body part were overrepresented, which were less represented, and in future, maybe even some description of the exact meat assortment intake in slaughter could be possible. We have unfortunately not time to describe the problems of this new method, but I hope in the future we will be able to solve it. Summarizing, we can tell that butchery distribution can be used and compared with a normal anatomical distribution, with a distribution of the bones which were found in exact archaeological site and archaeological assemblages, and it can give us more clear and more probable informations about it, which body part and of the animal and which part of the carcasses were more or less disrupted. In this way, I think we would be able to give you some more detailed information in future. So one more time, forgive me for my very long introduction. Really sorry, because I lost the time, actually. Thank you very much.
We thank you.
And we proceed with the next presentation by Dr. Alfred Galik from the Austrian Academy of Science, who will be speaking on the 7th century food in Ephesus.
Thank you very much for the invitation, giving me the opportunity to speak here again. Andreas has already introduced you Ephesus and all the places where Byzantine stuff was excavated. And so this is my first talk about Ephesian material since Sabine Laschet passed away, and I just dedicate this talk to her. And she was the leader of the excavation in Ephesus and the head of the Austrian Archaeological Institute, and a colleague of mine for a very long time. So last time I tried to bring results together from different kinds of excavations directed in Ephesus from the Hellenistic time over the Roman imperial period to the early Byzantine time. So this year I'm gonna reduce it to a case study which takes place in the so-called Domitian place in this business area, where a small storage room was excavated and a kitchen. And as Andreas already told you, it was totally destroyed. It burned down, it collapsed, and then it was sealed and it was not disturbed anymore. So what means everything was inside what was inside prior to destruction. And I just built it up as a classical archaeological presentation. Hope not to bore you too much with that. But before we start to talk about the findings, it's always a question of quantification. So it does make a difference if you have 5 remains or if you have 50,000 remains. And all these remains are coming from this destruction layer, and they are all contemporaneous. And the weight is about 30 kilos, and altogether it was about 25,000 bones, which we were working on. And a lot of the material has been wet sieved. A part of the material I did myself. The other one was sieved during the excavations and floated during the excavation. What you can see here is the hand-picked material is low in number but high in weight. And the sieved material is quite the opposite. It's high in number, but it has no weight because these are all the tiny things which are usually not appear in hand-picked or hand-collected excavations. And I'm gonna start with the fish bones for a certain purpose, because I told you before there was this storage room, and Andreas already showed that there were pots and amphorae with in situ finds which were burned and preserved. I hope you can read what's on that. I had the feeling it's a little bit out of focus, can it be? Otherwise, I just can explain. So this is fish remains which are usually not identifiable, but you see it's a fish remain. Then we have the group of the sparids with some identifiable gillheads, sea bream. Then we have here a group of parrotfishes. Then we have here a larger group with gray mullets. Then groupers, smaller groupers, lipfishes, Dicentarchus, what is this? The sea bass, bluefish, amberfish, spickerel, and the sardine in quite low numbers. So this was what came out of the sieved sediment samples. But as they started the excavation, they just sent me a picture which was out of here, and that's inside of an amphora. And in my first reaction, I thought they were just kidding on me because it's full of fish bones. And they took a photo in the backyard of a fish restaurant. But then it turned out the amphora were full of fish bones. And what you can see here is sorting myself all these tiny fish bones out. And before I started doing that, I just realized I sieved the sediment samples. And there were thousands and thousands of fish bones, and knowing the variability of fish you can find in Ephesus, I thought it takes me 200 years to identify all these species. So this is now the new representation. It turned out there's mainly 2 species. It's the mackerel. This one is the mackerel, and that's the Atlantic bonito. And you just see, I think the mackerels are up here and the bonito is down here. And what I sorted out is complete skeletons. So from the tip at the mouth to the tail, all the bones were represented. Even the smallest, thinnest, everything was there. What confused me a little bit, and I certainly do not overlook it, and I didn't lose it, there was not a single otolith in the amphora. Because first I just emphasized there were complete animals, or more or less complete animals, but then it turned out there are no otoliths. So maybe they were dissolved as they were stored inside of the amphora. and with the mackerel and the Atlantic bonito. So what you see here on top is a half fish that was lying next to an amphora on a plate. And it was then reconstructible. So that's the half of a fish. So here you have the cranial elements, the shoulder girdle, and also the part of the back spine. What you can see here is an estimation of fishes which came out of the amphora, and it's something about 70 and 80 fishes per amphora, which were preserved up to the half of the amphora. What else can see? So what I decided to do was to measure all the vertebrae to get an overview of the size distribution. What you can see here is they are very narrow distributed in size. That means these fishes were nearly of the same size, something between 30 and in the bonito up to 40 centimeters. And there is a picture beneath the mackerel. So these are Atlantic bonito vertebrae with cut marks. So they just cut the fishes in the middle, put it into the amphora, buried it with salt, sealed it, and then sold it to Ephesos. So what we have here is from the 7th century an archaeological evidence of salsamentum, where they just sold these complete fishes out of this amphora. So beside that, there were also other fishes. The first peak, this is sturgeons, and there is a high number of remains. But what you see on top is that's a scute of a sturgeon with cut marks on it. And there was the whole pectoral region of the sturgeon preserved. And what you can see here are the fin rays, which were partly sintered onto a plate or fixed with earth to a plate. The upper picture is a fin ray of a common carp with cut marks, where they obviously cut it from the body to remove the dorsal fin. And what you see beneath is quite large ribs of a fish, also with cut marks. So there was a kind of a preparation of the fishes ongoing there too. Sturgeon bones are quite rare, but they can come from the Mediterranean Sea. What is continuously found from the Hellenistic onwards over the Roman imperial period of freshwater fishes, like cyprinids, like bream or common carp, and also pike perch. And what also is found is eel bones, European eel bones, which obviously just wandered up the Küçük Menderes and were caught there. And there is one tiny bone of African catfish, even from the 7th century AD findings, which was or is interpreted or thought to be an import from Egypt to Africa since the Roman period. But from Turkey, I know them also in Hellenistic periods. So what else did we find there is a lot of mollusks. I'm not sure if you just can really read that. So what we just could see there is in the distribution, usually the eatable cockles are predominant, and the blue mussel Mytilus gallo-provincialis are not so dominant. Oysters are available. So what we see here is partly completely preserved mussels, like the carpet mussel with these 4 complete specimens, and the white peak of the blue mussel, depending on many fragments of these shells, which were all kept. But on the other hand, it illustrates that usually the blue mussels are completely underrepresented because all these little tiny fragments, they are not counted. So for better statistics, you should look at the hinge or the umbo and count left and right and do a minimum individual number for comparison. But anyway, so there is a whole bunch of marine gastropods too. Some of them are eatable, some not. Most of them are eatable. So there is the dogwag shell, murex, the Chrószcz, the needle shell, purple snail, and all of these could be consumed, but the dogwell is most represented. I don't know why. And then you have also freshwater remains. So there are freshwater mussels which cannot be really identified closer as Unionide. And we found some of larger specimens, because I found also in other contexts large freshwater shells, but without the hinge and without the teeth. And it was not really identifiable what kind of shell this is. And it turned out it's Protomida littoralis, and that's a species which doesn't occur anymore at this area. And from the terrestrial gastropods, many of them are coming from the sea residues, which are extant, recent. Some of them are better identifiable, some not. If some of these were eaten in the Antiquity or in the Byzantine area, then it's the large garden snail helix. So let's shift now to the mammals, to the most important domesticates, which is, of course, in this case, cattle, sheep and goat with an overhang of goats, and pig. And this is a comparison of weight in grams and the number of identified specimens, a numerical comparison. And there was one large bone that looked very much like camel, and there are some cat bones as well. And at the end, I will come back to the cat bones. So here, cattle is obviously important, such as the ovicaprines. As a next step, as we heard before, it's quite important to estimate how is the distribution of elements. And the method I prefer is to compare the weight. So EDP means Ephesos Domitiansplatz, the material, the archaeological material, and next to it, that's its zoos, and here it's sheep and cattle. This is the weight distribution of one skeleton with the shares in percent. And if you just compare the pig, there is much more head or cranial elements, less trunk, a bit less of limb bones, some metapodials, and underrepresentation of toe bones. It's more or less the same for the sheep. It's an overrepresentation of cranial elements and an underrepresentation of trunk bones like ribs and vertebrae, but they are still there. And if you just go to the cattle remains, so this would be the archaeological cattle, here the cranial elements are heavily overrepresented, and the trunk remains, the axial skeleton is heavily underrepresented. And even the long bones are underrepresented. So what I've shown here beneath is that all these remains have a lot of cut and chopping marks and were hacked into pieces. And this overrepresentation of cranial elements initially led me to the interpretation that they used mainly pieces of the skulls to make head soups for the pilgrims coming by and wanted something to eat and buy in the kitchen. The next step would be to look at the age distribution. And at the first glance, it was like most of the animals were very old. But if we just look at the cattle distribution, there is a share of several specimens that were killed under a year, and the less proportion survived a year. And there is, again, a higher proportion that was killed less than 2 years and less than 42 months, then they survived. So this is usually the slaughtering pattern you have when you just kill pigs for meat to have pork available. It's a similar distribution with the small ruminants. So there is a small amount of individuals that were just killed younger than half a year. But then they were just killed for tender meat, but also kept up to 2 years or 3 years, maybe for milk production or for hair and wool. But this is more a pattern for meat production. And if you just go to the cattle from the postcranial element, there are very few that indicates a killing less than 3 years. And most of the material that comes from cattle was killed in an adult stage. And I have here a very cryptic diagram. So the more pluses you have behind the teeth here, the more abraded they are. And if you just look here at the M1, the M2, and also the M3, they are mostly heavily abraded. So this also indicates that animals were quite old as they were just killed. Here I have milk teeth, which are changed with the permanent teeth at the same time, like this group when the third molar emerges. So there is a group that was killed with about 2 years, 2.5 years, but the major part was killed much later than that. Wild animals. So there is not much to say about wild animals. So the most important was the hair. There is a single bone of a badger. I don't know why. It's a fragment of a maxilla. 2 remains of wild boar and 4 remains of fallow deer. And one of these remains is this shaft. It's an antler shaft with a metal piece that was inside. So it didn't play a very large role, but maybe hair was quite important. So I'm not sure if you just can read this. This is the distribution of bird bones found in the assemblage. So most of them are mid-sized birds because the fragmentation is too high and they were not really identifiable, though they're most probably all of them are chicken. So this is the chicken part, and then you have here pheasant, quail, alectoris, then large birds, ducks, a crow, so like this coraquid here, a pigeon, small animals, small birds, singing birds, not identifiable, and few eggshells. And if you just look at the distribution, the mid-sized animals as well as the chicken, they were mainly used as adult individuals. Here is a more or less subadult rooster where the spur was not already fused to the shaft. But if you just look at the distribution, there were only a few roosters killed and offered, and the major part of meat came from chicken. And now, because everything was nicely sieved, evidences for the, let's say, commensal invisible animals or the pests became also visible. So there were lots of rat remains, lots of mouse remains, shrews. I think 3 different kind of shrews, 3 species. And what brings me now back to the cat is we just found some rat bones with puncture marks on it, and which looks very much like that the cat killed the rat before, and then the house collapsed and burned down and killed the cat. And finally, what we also found there is toads, not identifiable amphibians, and tree frogs, and also the predators of mice and this kind of amphibians, snake remains. So they were not able to escape. It burned, collapsed, and it also killed the natural fauna living within this city area. And what I tried to do last time is at a very large scale to compare what is really important to people living at certain areas at certain times. And now I just can add this one more completely. So this is all numerical. It's not per weight. What you can see here is there is a large part of sheep and goat. Typical for this Ephesian region, there is more goat than sheep, but the part of cattle is much larger than expected for a Byzantine context. So this means you should be always aware what kind of contexts do you have, what people live there, and then you just can maybe make interpretations about what they eat and what they preferred. And this is a kitchen for people coming by, buying things to eat. And with that, I just say thank you for your attention. And you have seen this before, and now it's more complete, the picture.
Thank you so much, Alfred, for this wonderful talk on a very nicely sealed assemblage in Ephesus. And we continue with Dr. Dimitra Mylona from the Institute for Aegean Prehistory, who will be talking on fishers' knowledge from antiquity to the present through Byzantium.
Well, I should tell you that I'm very happy to be here with you today, and thank you very much for inviting me. My presentation today is not the usual type, where methodologies and results of research are presented. It's mostly an attempt to test the waters, so to speak, about an idea for future research. I very much wanted to test it with you, an audience which is very experienced in mining data from a very wide range of sources, and also experienced in dealing with topics out of the ordinary. My main focus is fishing technology in the past. This is one of the least understood aspects of ancient fisheries, unlike fish consumption, fish processing, trade, and fish symbolism, which have attracted lots of attention that resulted in quite intensive and nuanced research. But fishing technology is a tricky subject, and I will explain why. Before we move on, let me start with a basic assumption. This assumption is based on observation and also on fishing ethnography all over the world. A fishing tool is more than its material form. A fishing tool also encompasses the knowledge that lies behind it. How to find the raw materials to build a fishing tool, how to make one that is effective, but also how to use it, where to use it, what fish species to target, how to take advantage of the fish's physiology and biology, how to prepare for the act of fishing using that tool, how to deal with fellow fishers in the process, how to talk about it. All these are aspects of the same thing, the fishing tool, its effectiveness and its agency. Now, if we view fishing technology like this, it becomes clear that one of its most important aspects is the fisher's knowledge that is invested in it. And this is the tricky issue. Fisher's knowledge, or what is often known in current literature as traditional ecological knowledge, can be a very powerful tool in our archaeological research, I think. Anthropological and ethnographic research all over the world has repeatedly shown one thing. In traditional fishing societies, the transmission of fishing knowledge from one generation to the next was done, and to some degree it is still done in some places, through internship, through participation in the action of fishing, but most importantly, in the life of a whole fishing community. The persons initiated in fishing and learning how to do it have to learn not only the practical aspects of the art of fishing, but also the intangible aspects, the proper way of thinking and believing and behaving within a community of fishers. Now, if we turn this observation on its head, we can assume, I think, that where we have documented transmission of knowledge on fishing technology, then we can be certain that there was some fishing community that supported it. Thus, I propose we can use the fishing technology as a vehicle to identify and explore those fishing communities of the past. I should note here that those parts of ancient and medieval societies, the fishing part of it, are so far hardly known. Before we move on to the next part of the presentation, let me illustrate this long-lived continuation in fishers' knowledge that I talked to you about with some examples. This is a parrotfish, skaros in Greek. Oppian, in the 2nd century of the Common Era, described a crafty way to catch them by using a female live fish as a decoy to attract the males and catch them with a small net. The same story is also told by George Lefkavitis in a fishing manual in 1941. Fishhooks have the exact same shape for millennia, and they have been used in the same manner also. They seem to be considered diachronically as basic fishing tools, and that is why they are suitable for beginners. Finally, here are several instances of long lines separated from each other by centuries. So, how can we go about researching fishing technology in the comprehensive way I described earlier? We normally do that directly or indirectly. Let me show you what sort of evidence we usually use to talk about fishing technology. First of all, we have the remains of marine creatures that are found in archaeological excavations. And here I show you fish bones, small and large. Or here we have the hard elements of marine mollusks and other marine creatures. These are what is left of the ancient catches. In other words, they represent the successful use of certain fishing tools. We can identify them to species. The type of animals and their size may provide some indication on the fishing technology used for their capture. We use marine biology and ecology as a guide for that exercise. Where fish live, their daily and seasonal life circles, their behavioral pattern, what we call ethology, determine to a certain degree what tool would be effective for their capture. Some fish take the bait, others not. Some live hidden in crevices on the seafloor and cannot be taken by nets, and others are too small to be captured by fish hooks. These are some simple examples, but the fishing reality is much more complex, of course. Then we have remains of actual fishing tools. In particular, we find only the durable elements of the fishing tools, those that survive time. The organic elements have in most cases been lost. The plant or animal fibers of the lines or the actual net or the wooden elements are long gone. Sometimes we find the remnants of structures related to fishing, such as this Roman fish tank here, or the Ceranea, the fish processing establishments like this one from Spain. The implication of these preservation issues is that by identifying the object as a particular type of a fishing tool, in reality we interpret it. And very often we do that very imprecisely. For example, was the metal hook that I show you here used for fishing? What sort of tool did it belong to? A line and hook? A long line? Here we enter a gray area. Then, fishing technology could be illustrated in art, as you see in this miniature here. In illustrations, we can see the whole tool in action and its relationship to its physical and cultural environment. Such illustrations are very informative on the shapes of the fishing tool, but also, importantly, on more elusive aspects of their technology, such as the bodily moves and postures involved in their use. But again, in this case, we often need to interpret these illustrations. We need to give a name to the tool, and we need mental constructs to think about it. Another rich source of data on fishing technology is something familiar to most of you, the written sources. Whether literary or inscriptional, texts are eloquent sources of information on all sorts of aspects of this technology. What is very important is that aside from shape, material, and manner of use, texts give us words, terms that were linked to specific tools and actions, and also they give us an idea of the cultural context of fishing technology in given points in time and space. But unfortunately, written sources are what they are. they contain some degree of bias that is inherent in any text. Additionally, they were not produced to illuminate us on fishing technology, so in most cases, the information they convey is inadequate, fragmentary, or downright cryptic. In the Hellenistic inscription that I'm showing you here, for example, we learn about the existence of a Thinion, a stationary tuna trap, on a contested part of the borders between two cities, Arsinoi and Troezen, in the Argolid, in the Peloponnese. We know from other sources what a Thinion was, and in this case, we learn that the income generated by it was considerable and was shared by the two cities. All these are fairly specific, but we are not informed what species of fish exactly were caught there in that Thinia, how big the Thinia were, how many fishes and of what origin worked there, what were the nets of the Thinion made of, how they took care of them, and where did they store them off-season. All these and others are issues that remain unknown. Well, I'm not sure if you noticed that with all the categories of data on fishing technology, there is one common key aspect, and that is the need to interpret the data at our disposal, whether they are archaeological, artistic, or literary. In other words, we need to know beforehand all the possible aspects that could be linked to a fishing tool or method. On a very simple level, why do we call these objects that I will show you here? In this picture, I just show you a present-day Thinion in the region that I was talking about, and the representation of it. Anyway, so on a very simple level, why do we call these objects that you see here at the top, these ones, why do we call them fishing nets? And those ones were published as a cast net weights. And why do we call this action here a bit sign? In archaeology, we do this kind of interpretations all the time without even thinking about them twice. We make analogies with our own modern experience. But of course, most of us do not have such detailed, in-depth knowledge and experience on fishing. And here comes ethnography and also anthropology to give us a hand. By observing how fishes do things today, and by learning why, we acquire those mental constructs, the images that help us think about the archaeological, artistic, and literary evidence on ancient fishing. We are equipped with analogies, in other words. We also become aware of the many aspects that are involved in decision-making concerning fishing technology and how these are related to other facets of life. In other words, we don't learn how things were done in the past, but in reality we become less naive with our interpretations. Having all this in mind, I came up with an idea of doing a project on the ethnoarchaeology of fishing. In particular, I will try to examine ancient technology from the point of view of the fisher's knowledge as I described it earlier. And I think that the idea is great. But how should I go about doing it? When one works in Greece today, or in all Mediterranean coasts for that matter, ethnographic work on fishing is almost non-existent. Unlike other parts of the world, here ethnography in the past century focused on farming and pastoral issues, with traditional fishing not being investigated in any systematic manner. And after 1970s and 1980s, fishing technology was revolutionized by the use of diesel engines on fishing boats, by the use of plastic nets and lines, sonar technology, onboard freezing of catch, access to supra-regional or even global markets, and in the case of Europe, the common fishing policy, which aimed to regulate and homogenize fishing practices along European coasts. One of the side effects of all these abrupt and overarching changes was that very many artisanal inshore fishing practices were abandoned. The younger generations did not follow their parents' profession, and globalization hit small-scale inshore fishing the most, making it unviable. The result of the above is that the chain of knowledge transmission from one generation to the next, through participation of the youngsters, has been broken, and a large part of that knowledge is already lost. So, where can we find the kind of information we need to understand ancient technology in the comprehensive way we are talking about? Here I see two roads. One is the classic one, to do ethnographic field work targeting peripheral areas or amateur fishers who may still hold some of the old ways, and to record, of course, whatever still survives. The other way is to look for this type of ethnographic information in literature, modern, medieval, and ancient. Works like this, for example, the title of this book is Fishing in the Greek Shores, the Tools, the Ways, the Fish. Now, works like this may be useful. This is a manual for amateur fishers written in 1941. It describes in detail the whys and hows in the use of certain fishing tools, and it was written before the era of drastic changing in fishing technology. Moving back in time, all kinds of sources may contain information useful to my quest, from obvious fishing works like Oppian's Halieustics, or parts of Aristotle's and Pliny's works, to medieval literature, Life of Sands, and others. Also, representations in art and photographs, like the ones I have shown you today, may also be useful. But written and artistic sources are, as we have seen, rather problematic sources. How can we safely use them without going in circles? One way to do it, I think, is to work on a cumulative way, so to speak, and that is to create a record for each tool and fishing method, which will include all relevant information of any source possible from any period within our research area. And this record is built around certain predetermined themes, as you can see them here in this table. The idea is that once all data are collected, certain patterns may be revealed that will show continuities and changes of certain aspects of the tool or the method and its use over time. This in itself is interesting because it may be linked to broader historical conditions, but it also speaks of disruptions and innovations in the transmission of fishers' knowledge. I'm still at the stage of data collecting, and I have not applied this method in a large enough scale to see if it will actually work. But I would love to hear your views on it, taking advantage of your wide expertise with the sources that I intend to use. Thank you.
So, any questions, please?
I'm wondering about because it really just, I'm just thinking with you right now on this kind of an approach. So, you know, with our project, we're working with perfumes, and we collect all the information about ingredients, basically like what other scholars have said these things might be. We take a Greek term or a Latin term or an Egyptian term, we find out all the identifications, and then we just run through them all and test them, right? So we're just trying to see like what are the effects if we change the ingredients to what these scholars have said, and does that give us the result that that we're told? I can't imagine doing that with fishing, right? Like it's going to be like because you know often you just don't catch fish when you go fishing because they're not there. So it's, you know, I mean, so I'm just wondering, so what would it look like to do a kind of empirical study where you collect all this information and go, would you test it, or would this be more just kind of like making field notes about what people were up to or doing kind of archive research, or would you consider doing kind of empirical work, and then what would that even look like, I guess?
The thing is, today we do have the impression that if we go to the coast and we use a tool, we'll catch fish because it's a simple thing. It's not. To catch fish, you need to know some very specific details. If you talk to a fisherman, they give you these details and they come from their experience, which means that they think that those details gave them successful catches.
Yeah. Often they're going to keep that secret.
Well, yes, sometimes they did keep them secrets and we don't know about them. Sometimes we find this information. We find fragments of information. I don't think we can do a systematic work like an ethnographic recording because truly most of this knowledge is lost now. We've done a research program, an ethnographic research program on fishing cultural heritage in northern Greece, and northern Greece is a hub of fishing in Greece. It's the seas there are the richest in Greece and in Eastern Mediterranean for that matter. And we particularly targeted the fishing community in Kavala, a town which lives from fishing to a large degree, and it has long traditions of fishing. Throughout our quests, the only information we could find were about trolling and I don't remember what's the name for the night fishing for small pelagic fish, the ones that you use the lights.
Right.
Yes, I know the Greek, but I can't remember the English. Well,
Perhaps they know
anyway, the thing is that if you ask people about fishing in that region, nobody ever tells you anything about small-scale inshore fishing. It doesn't exist in their minds because nobody practices it. So this knowledge is lost. I'm trying to think of possible ways to find some of it or fragments of it. I'm not sure that I answered what you asked.
No, I'm just thinking through things really. So thanks.
I'm not even sure myself. I mean, I thought that this would be a good opportunity to discuss it with people who are experienced in all sorts of research.
First of all, actually to all three of the speakers, you mentioned that they were using nets, but these were the trolling nets or throwing nets. What kind of a net fishing was it? Like, what way? I can hardly imagine a large trolling net used in the ancient times, like the nylon type. And then the same size of the fish, does it imply they were caught with the same size of a net? Because if they are all the same size, or more or less the same size, and if they were putting the fish into the amphora without disemboweling them, that you said they just cut them in half. They didn't remove the head. They didn't disembowel, remove the inside. And the last thing, like I said, 3 very short questions. Like even nowadays, we use all the parts of the animals, even the hooves and the legs for some products of jelly or something. If there are only remaining bones of the parts that are most attractive to the buyers, where are the remaining parts? They should be somewhere. So if we've got a lot of heads, there should be a place with lots of legs or something. And it might be a naive question, but I can hardly imagine they disappeared. They should be in some place. I don't know where. If you could just...
How to catch fish in ancient times or even in prehistoric times depends very much on what you find from an archaeological perspective. Preservation is usually not suitable for preserving these things because they are gone. The floaters, they are made of wood, they do not preserve. If you have now waterlogged sediments, then you may find nets and sinkers and floaters and everything. So if you just go further, you just have pictures of how to fish on plates, in mosaics, and there you just can see how they use the nets. And in Antiquity and in In Byzantine times, they used cast nets, then they used signs, they used all kinds of of how to catch fish. They didn't have the technical potentials to have these heavy dragging trawlers to push the nets with them. But on the other hand, they just could have this kind of floating nets somewhere in the pelagic and catch fishes there. So if you just know that the tunas are coming, you just have places where you just put the nets inside and they're just gliding alongside of the nets, and then you just harvest them. So that's all possible. If you have mackerels or Atlantic bonitos, that means these are swarm fishes, and usually if you have a swarm like that, they are more or less of the same size. And if not, and you just catch them, and you just put them into an amphora and put them with the salt that the body and the fish meat preserves, then you just try to standardize the size. What they obviously did, they just chopped them through the middle, and I guess they removed the intestines. Otherwise, if you don't remove that, you produce garum, but not salsamentum. That's the point. But they just left the heads on the fish. They didn't remove it. Also the gills. They didn't remove the gills. I found the bones, and but I think they just cut them through in the middle, removed the intestines, and then they just put it into amphora, made a layer of salt, layer of fish, layer of salt, and that's how this kind of fishes in very similar size can be explained. And the final question was, where are the bones that are not found? That's a good question, because we didn't know, we didn't find them. So theoretically, it depends very much on where you are in the chronological stage. Very early, people used everything. They just cracked even the phalanges to get out the marrow. So later on, when in Roman period, or even later, you have butchers. Their job is to dismember the carcasses. Then you just have this kind of separation. And in theory, you just have parts of in the body, the parts in the body that offers less meat and offers more meat or valuable meat. And there can be a separation at the place where they just started to kill them and dismember them and butcher them. So they just remove all the heads because it's very valuable, because they just use the horns. And then you have somewhere a large pit or a large heap with horn cores. And when you excavate that, you're very happy as an archaeologist, because you just can see the variability of horn cores and can reconstruct how cattle looked like in this period of time. So there are various ways how and why parts of the body can disappear. But it does not mean that certain parts of a carcass are of less value. So if I've shown, if people are producing head soup, then you have a lot of cranial elements. So maybe all the tender meat and loin and all the stuff goes somewhere else. But for the pilgrim soup, they just bought the cheaper heads and boiled them. So this is, for example, something how you just can explain why body parts are just moved away, and some of them appear there and some of them appear here. And if you don't have the whole area excavated, you find just a piece there. So it's also driven by a theoretical way to interpret that there are body parts with more meat and body parts with less meat, of less value. But if you just have the ribs and you make barbecue, it's of high value, yes? Or like we discussed it before, so there are special recipes for metacarpals, metatarsals, finger bones of. It depends on it. It can be cattle, it can be pig, and they are chopped and they are boiled, and you make a soup, and that's a specialty. So it must not mean if these parts are sensu stricto without any value. It depends very much on the situation. It depends very much on the status. It depends very much on the people living at a certain place and what they want to eat.
Yeah, I just want to proceed about what Alfred was already saying about, and what he also rightly said in his paper, that context is important, and it's maybe possible that some parts of the animal were dismembered in some areas in an excavated area and others somewhere else. And maybe that's good to know for our Polish colleague who didn't find any trucks or carcasses in the Theodosian Harbour, because it's possible that they were just cutting off heads and other parts of the animals, and that the carcasses went to the meat market, which were near the harbours actually. So in Constantinople you had special meat and grain markets, the Ceranea, which were very close to the harbours. So it's possible that all these trunks and carcasses went to these areas where the butchers were. Maybe there they were cut in more parts of the animals. So again, maybe these carcasses can be found in another area in Constantinople, present-day Istanbul. This is just what I want to let you know. The other thing is for Dimitra. I really like your model, and I encourage you to continue with your model, and I'll explain why. Because as a student, I worked for a Dutch team working in Italia Acanania in the Pindus Mountains, where they did since the 1980s a lot of research, including also, we had also an anthropologist and also social geographers working with us. And since the 1980s, teams went to 300 villages in the mountains and the coastal areas, and they interviewed the older people in the cafeneons in all these villages. And they came with very systematic lists of questions, and they asked all kind of questions to these people who still knew about the genre de vie before the Second World War. And they asked also about the economy and how people were moving through the mountains and everything. Many information came out of these interviews. And were put online. Actually, you can find them in a database. I can give you the link later on. But it was very interesting that all this information coming from these village interviews could be combined with an ethnographer, a Greek ethnographer, who was also working in that mountainous area and wrote several books about it in the 1920s. So we had wonderful information, and we combine these interviews with this ethnographic information. And it's a wealth of information. And I think you can still do it now, before all this information is gone. So I want to encourage you, please do this also with the village and communities regarding fishing techniques. It's so important. I assume there are still some elderly people who know about these traditional systems. So please continue with your model. I just want to encourage you.
Thank you. The elderly people now, the elderly fishermen who are about 70, 80 years old, they were active in the 70s and 80s when the change happened. So they may remember what their parents did. Their parents knew. Those people give us an echo of what the current old people give us an echo of what was happening before. But then you're right. Once you start collecting these data, then you see trends and repeated patterns, which are quite interesting, actually.
Sorry?
Alfred, can I just Can I just say that as an aficionado of garum, I think what you have in that amphora is mackerel, liquamen, not salsamenta.
It's liquamen.
It's liquamen. It's a high-end liquamen. If they don't take the gills out,
Yeah, but
and
then
it's
you
contaminated,
just
if they
have
don't take the
all
gills,
you have all the bones inside.
yeah, I know. That's exactly what you want with liquamen, is all the bones. If you don't take the gills out, the fish is contaminated with blood, and it would decay, even with all that salt. Salsamenta is cleaned, and even salted to clean it, to get all the blood out of the flesh, so that the fish will survive long term in the brine. Dimitra, am I? Yeah.
But those amphorae were packed with bones.
Yeah. Yeah. But then if you cut them up, you can pack it in. And I don't think it's just salt, I think it'll probably be brine as well. And the whole thing dissolves into a liquamen. And long-term storage, to mature it, would end up with the otoliths dissolving.
Maybe, I wasn't sure, but I always thought that high-end quality liquamen is just liquid, and with
Oh,
no.
it is, because you filter out all the bits and all the paste. You end up with a very concentrated.
Yeah, but
high
then
protein
you
liquor.
just import everything with the bones.
Do you?
You import the amphora
Yeah.
with the bones,
It's-
and
yeah.
then you sort it
And
out.
then you
Yeah,
filter.
it's fermented in transit.
Yeah,
That's how it's.
yeah.
You actually put. Yeah, I mean you're right about cutting it up and putting it directly into the amphora with the salt, shipping it, leaving
Is it
it.
going to explode?
No.
No.
It
No,
would
it's
be.
not that kind of fermentation. It's enzyme hydrolysis. It's not bacteria.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, but then there was this half fish next to the amphora, and if it's liquamen, then they can't take a fish out, so it's completely dissolved and all the bones.
It was outside of the amphora.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was on a plate outside of the amphora.
Ah.
Well, you could replicate it actually. You know how many fish there were in its amphora? You know how big they were? So if you replicate it, no, truly, you will see how much liquid comes out of it.
Yeah.
No. So the question is if it goes into liquid or it stays
Dry.
not dry, but if it doesn't decay, it doesn't
If-
ferment. That's the question.
If you put fish and salt together, they will completely disintegrate and dissolve into a paste and a liquid.
Not necessarily,
Not
Sally.
necessarily.
My
because-
father makes
Yeah.
this product that Alfred found.
Yeah.
There is no time for decay, for dissolving, because we eat them before that stage.
That's another parameter.
Yes.
But I just know that from the Mediterranean area, they just brought up to Austria these kind of pieces of salted tuna, and that was preserved and didn't
Oh
solve.
no, it will. No, I mean,
Solid salt.
yeah,
Yes,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. It goes hard. In other words.
yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I just think because the gills are present, there's too much
The
blood in
gills
the
are
head.
present. Yes.
There's too much blood in the head, and it would contaminate. the fish.
Yeah, but if you
So I
just
think it's fully eviscerated as well.
yeah, I was thinking about that, but on the other hand, so
Because you need the viscera to dissolve the fish. That's the point. It
Yeah.
will stay solid unless you have the viscera present, because that's where the enzymes are that dissolve the flesh. Yeah, but yeah, I understand. It's difficult.
Sorry, every.
If you put just salt inside, it will dry up like the bacalao, like the.
yeah, but then you have to expose it to sun and to wind
Yeah,
to dry it.
Dimitra, I wanted to follow up on what you were saying about the ethnographic work. I think you should switch areas where you're going to go to smaller islands. In the Cyclades, and not the very touristic and big islands, but the smaller islands, you have people that it's very interesting how we conceive what is being an islander, because you have the captains who are doing fishing, and then you have the shepherds that they only do animals and they don't know how to fish. But you have families that are doing that on a family level, so very small scale. And I have a specific island in mind, Kufonisi, where you have young kids that they haven't left the island, so that they have their knowledge of their grandparents. So this knowledge is not lost. You need to go away from the big fishing areas.
Yes. When I come in my memory, just like 50 years ago, and before Lent, which was fasting period, yeah. So me and my grandmother, for instance, we were going to the fish shop, yeah, and buying herrings, which are the stuff that, which is the stuff for Lent in Poland, at least. And I just remember
fresh herrings. Fresh herrings.
Pardon?
You were buying fresh herrings.
No.
Or
just
salted.
Salted
Okay.
herrings, because fresh herrings were inaccessible here, especially in this area. It's not a fish country. Yeah, it weren't, definitely. So we would go to a shop in which there were barrels of herrings, and there were usually two kinds. One was gutted, and the other one wasn't. And the gutted were usually more expensive, they were larger, while the ungutted ones were smaller and, say, assorted. So they were all different sort of the different kind. But usually we bought the cheaper ones. And once we bought it, we took it home and we would gut it. And of course, the one kind and the other was in brine.
It was
and there was plenty of brine.
Plenty of brine.
Yes, exactly. So it means that any fish doesn't have to be gutted, provided it's well salted and it preserves. Of course, there are different ways of preserving with the addition of salt. Like, for instance, famous Swedish. But this is, you know, a special technique, a special way of. So mackerels and those bonitos were almost the same size, provided you cut bonitos in halves. Yeah? And they were basically put salt in it. Water could be added, but not necessarily, because they are, I mean, fish are plenty of. And if you take fresh fish and you put salt, so what the water, the liquid appears, and this is the brine is used. If it's too salty, you can add some water. If not, I mean, I do it, for instance, with meat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Before Christmas, for instance, because we've got the tradition of killing meat, and this is a just basic technique. And I know it from my experience, yeah, because I used to do it, and my children want to return to this tradition, and for instance, for a couple of years, they did the same. Not with fish, but with meat, but basically, the skin is the same. So this returning to something like knowledge, which is still existing, it's extremely, extremely important, because it preserves something like common sense competence of normal people that use knowledge, not for constructing something like very peculiar and sophisticated theories, but to live themselves quite happily and see something that was palatable.
Now, you said something that ticks me off, I'm afraid. You talked about common sense. But common sense is like the archaeologist trying to interpret antiquity with common sense. It doesn't really, it's not just common sense, because behind food.
Common sense in this way, in my interpretation, is like a basic ability to judge whether a certain technique can be applied. So that means that you've got to have some knowledge and some skills as far as a certain area of our life is concerned. We've got very good examples, like for instance, Galik, who is with us and who is a classicist, but at the same time, she's quite competent as far as cooking is concerned.
Well, yes, it is complex though, is it?
It is complex, that's the thing, because in terms of preserved fish, let's say, or preserved food, indeed there are few basic techniques to do it. And indeed, when you do it, you preserve food and make it last for longer. But behind that, you create new products, new tastes, new textures, and also new ideas. People don't eat preserved fish just because they need some food that lasts in the winter. They do it because it tastes special, it tastes good, because for all sorts of reasons. This is one thing that we have in mind. The other thing that we have in mind is that we can't really discuss these things in the abstract because we have a whole range of choices and circumstances. When Sally did her research on garum, most of the information she had, most of the data she used, was pertaining to large-scale commercial production of garum. But alongside that, there was the smaller scale, the domestic or community scale production of processed fish. Somewhere there, between the two scales and between the huge variety, there is so much variation that I feel uncomfortable to talk in general terms about these things.
It's a very good point.
Yeah.
But you know, this competence means that you can choose out of many methods just to attain a result you want. If you produce something at home, you don't have to have like 300 kilos of tunas because 30 will do simply for a whole year. And basically people used to use this knowledge, and nowadays they can return to this and do the same, like you do, for instance, when you cure meat. And for my family, 4 kilograms of ham will do. And I don't have to produce like 40, although I'm able to. Yeah. So this is basically, this common sense is like knowledge.
Yeah, I understand what you mean.
And people know what to do, and they still know how to use it, and we should. And this is very common sense approach to you, for you, yours, I mean. Because like, for instance, 30 years ago, going back to something like ethno-knowledge, for an academic working in classics, it was unthinkable. This is not the method. They would have said that this is not the method for me. So thank you.